The plane was flying smoothly, making a soft humming noise that echoed through the cabin. The sound was relaxing, like a lullaby. It made many people on the plane feel sleepy, and some of them were already closing their eyes. But for Serena Wallace, it was far from a normal flight. It was not a quiet, peaceful journey. For Serena, it was more than just a flight. It was a moment of freedom, a moment she had been waiting for a long time. She looked out the window, watching the clouds float by like fluffy cotton balls. Serena had never been one to take flights often, but today, she was in first class. First class was special. It was a luxury she had worked hard to earn. The plush seat she was sitting in felt like a small reward after weeks of long, tiring hours at work. She sighed with relief as she settled into the seat, adjusting her legs and stretching her arms. She was finally going to have some time to herself. A break from the fast pace of life. But Serena didn't just get here by chance. She had earned this seat. She had worked so hard, taking on extra tasks, staying late at the office, making sacrifices. And now, for the first time in weeks, she could relax. The world outside her window seemed so peaceful. It was a moment she thought she deserved. A moment she thought would be perfect. She opened a book to pass the time. It was a mystery novel, one she had been looking forward to reading for a long time. But before she could start reading, she felt someone approaching. Serena turned her head to see a flight attendant walking towards her. The woman was tall and had a tight smile on her face. But there was something about her smile that didn't seem real. It looked like she was forcing it. Serena didn't know why, but she immediately felt uneasy. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice sweet but sharp. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to move. This seat is reserved for another passenger." Serena's eyebrows shot up. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with confusion. She looked at the flight attendant, waiting for an explanation. "You're not allowed here," the flight attendant said again, her smile still there but more cold. Serena could see the woman's eyes narrowing as she spoke. It wasn't just the words. It was the way the flight attendant spoke to her, like Serena didn't belong. Like Serena wasn't worthy of being in first class. It made Serena feel strange inside. "Please, gather your things," the flight attendant added, her tone more firm now. Serena's stomach dropped. She had worked hard to get this seat. She had paid for it, and yet here was this woman telling her to leave. Something about it didn't feel right. Serena's heart sank a little, but she didn't let the flight attendant see how upset she was. She wasn't going to let this moment ruin her trip. This was her time to relax. She had earned this. Serena took a deep breath and stayed calm. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her. Some of them were glancing over, their eyes filled with curiosity, maybe even judgment. Serena could sense it. But she wasn't going to let them get to her. She wouldn't let this woman, or anyone else, take away her peace. The flight attendant was still standing there, waiting for Serena to move. Serena thought about the situation for a moment. It didn't make sense. Why would they ask her to leave the seat? She had seen other people on the plane in first class. They weren't being asked to move. There was something strange going on. The flight attendant's gaze didn't soften. Serena could feel the tension in the air. It was like a storm was brewing. But Serena wasn't going to let it break her. She was strong. She had learned to stand tall in situations like this. She had learned to rise above the noise. But what was happening here? Why was the flight attendant asking her to move? And why did she feel so out of place? Serena wasn't sure. All she knew was that she had to do something. She couldn't just sit there and let it happen. Serena's eyes flickered around the cabin, noticing the way other passengers avoided looking her way. Some of them even shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as though the attention was too much. The woman beside her, a tall, sharply dressed figure, didn't seem to be facing the same problem. No, this was for Serena. The woman, with her perfect red lipstick and neat, expensive-looking clothes, didn't even seem to notice what was going on. She was busy reading a magazine, flipping the pages with quick, smooth movements. Serena looked at her, wondering if she, too, had experienced this kind of treatment before. Maybe she had, but she didn't show it. Maybe that was the trick: don't let people see that it bothers you. Just as Serena was about to turn her attention back to the flight attendant, she heard a male voice interrupting from a few rows ahead. The man was tall and wore a gray suit. He had a serious look on his face, but his voice was calm. "Is there an issue here?" Serena glanced up at him, grateful for the distraction, but unsure of what to expect. She had seen people like him before, men in suits who were used to having power. He probably thought he could just walk up and solve the problem with a few words. But Serena knew better. She had seen this game played before. The flight attendant, still standing straight, turned to face him. She flashed a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No issue, just a small misunderstanding," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. Serena could see it in the woman's eyes. The words didn't match what she felt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. The woman had judged her the second she stepped onto the plane. She had made a choice. And now Serena was paying the price. Serena could feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about the seat. It was something deeper. Serena had always known that people judged her based on her looks, her skin color, the way she spoke, maybe even the way she carried herself. It wasn't fair, but she had grown used to it. She had learned to smile, nod, and move on. But this felt different. It was as if the flight attendant wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It was like Serena was invisible, except for the way people looked at her, judging her every move. She was being treated like she didn't belong, and that hurt in a way she hadn't expected. The flight attendant stood tall, waiting for Serena to comply, but Serena wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. A quiet resolve began to form within her, like a shield she could wear to protect herself. She wasn't going to just give in. She wasn't going to let this woman or anyone else make her feel small. Serena took a deep breath, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her. They weren't saying anything, but she could feel their thoughts swirling around her. Some were curious, some were judgmental, and some looked just plain uncomfortable. She glanced around the cabin again, trying to collect her thoughts. There was something about this moment, something that felt off. The energy in the air was thick with tension, like something was about to explode. But Serena wasn't sure what it was yet. She wasn't going to act impulsively, though. She had learned in life that patience could be a powerful tool, and right now, she needed to be smart. Her mind raced as she thought of her options. She could keep quiet, let the flight attendant win, and move to the back of the plane like she was being told. But no, that wasn't Serena. She wasn't going to let anyone walk all over her. She wasn't going to let this woman, this stranger, decide where she belonged. "Excuse me," Serena said, her voice steady but calm. It was important to keep her tone even. If she sounded too emotional, it might make her look weak. "I'm sorry, but I paid for this seat. I have a right to be here." The flight attendant's smile tightened, and she leaned in slightly, as if she didn't want to be overheard. "This seat is reserved for another passenger," she said, her voice a little colder now. Serena felt her heart race. Something didn't add up. The woman had already told her to move without explaining why. And now, she was giving an excuse that didn't make sense. "I don't understand," Serena said slowly. "If this seat is reserved, why was I allowed to sit here in the first place?" The flight attendant didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the other passengers, some of whom were beginning to take notice of the conversation. Serena could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to do something. It was like a silent audience, and the pressure of their attention weighed on her. But she refused to back down. The man in the suit, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "Is everything okay?" he asked again, this time with more force in his voice. There was a slight frown on his face, as though he was starting to notice the tension in the air. The flight attendant quickly straightened up and gave him another tight smile. "Everything's fine, sir. There's just a small mix-up. Nothing to worry about." But Serena could see through the lie. It wasn't fine. The flight attendant wasn't being honest, and the whole situation felt wrong. Serena opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could say anything, the man in the suit turned his attention to her. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice gentler now. He was trying to be diplomatic, but there was a hint of authority in his tone. He looked at Serena as though he was ready to solve the problem, whatever it was. Serena hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also didn't want to back down. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. "There is a problem. I paid for this seat, and I am being asked to move for no reason. I don't understand why." The man looked at the flight attendant. She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she glanced at the floor, shifting uncomfortably on her feet. I believe there was a mistake," she said, her voice trailing off. "But I'm just doing my job, sir." The man raised an eyebrow. "Your job? Or are you judging this passenger based on something else?" The question hung in the air, and the flight attendant froze. Serena watched as her face reddened slightly. The flight attendant opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. She clearly wasn't used to being confronted like this. Serena could see the change in the man's posture. He stood a little taller, his expression now one of quiet authority. It was clear that he wasn't going to let this slide. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, "I think we need to clear this up right now. Please show this lady back to her seat." The flight attendant's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't argue. She nodded stiffly and turned to lead Serena back to first class. As Serena walked toward the front of the plane, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by something darker: anger. She had just been humiliated in front of all these people. Her dignity had been questioned. And it was all because of the way she looked, the way she was judged. But now, at least for this moment, she had won. She had stood her ground. Serena followed the flight attendant, who now seemed somewhat flustered. She led her toward the front of the plane, the sound of the cabin doors closing behind them. The flight attendant kept her posture rigid, walking a bit too quickly, clearly trying to avoid any further attention. Serena's eyes scanned the cabin again, noting the passengers who had continued to glance in her direction. Some had turned their heads quickly, pretending to be engrossed in their books or movies, but Serena could feel the weight of their eyes. She could feel them judging, wondering why she was causing a scene, why she wasn't just accepting what had happened and moving on. But Serena wasn't going to move on. Not this time. The flight attendant came to a halt in front of the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin. She paused for a moment, glancing back at Serena. It was clear now that she wasn't sure how to handle this situation. The confidence from earlier had evaporated, replaced by an uncertainty Serena had been waiting for. "Please wait here," the flight attendant said quickly, her voice more tense than before. She slipped past the curtain and disappeared into the first-class section. Serena stood in the narrow aisle, her hands gripping the armrests of the economy seats on either side of her. The awkward stillness was unbearable. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline of the moment still buzzing through her veins. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She wasn't going to let this moment break her. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her angry or upset. But inside, she was boiling. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't even just about being moved. This was about how she had been made to feel so small, so invisible, just because of who she was. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She had worked so hard for everything she had. Nothing in her life had been handed to her. Every achievement, every success, had been earned through hours of hard work, determination, and sacrifice. And yet, here she was, being told she didn't belong in the seat she had paid for, just because someone had decided she wasn't the right kind of person to be sitting in first class. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. She could hear the soft murmur of conversation from the other side of the curtain. The flight attendant had returned, now accompanied by a man in a sharp blue uniform. Serena's eyes narrowed. This new figure was taller than the flight attendant, with broad shoulders and a no-nonsense attitude. He had the kind of look that told you he was in charge. A senior crew member, perhaps the head of the flight crew. He didn't look at Serena directly, but his presence was unmistakable. Serena knew what this was now, a power struggle. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about her standing her ground and refusing to be treated as less than. They had underestimated her, assumed she would simply accept the treatment without a word. But they hadn't counted on her strength, her refusal to let them push her down. The man in the blue uniform spoke first, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" he asked, though there was no hint of genuine concern in his tone. It was the kind of question someone asked when they already thought they knew the answer, when they were preparing to dismiss you without really listening. Serena didn't let the question throw her. She stood tall, her back straight and her chin slightly lifted. "Yes, there is a problem," she replied, her voice firm but controlled. "I paid for a seat in first class, and I was moved without any explanation. The flight attendant didn't offer a reason. I was treated unfairly." The man's eyes flickered to the flight attendant, who avoided his gaze. The tension in the air thickened. Serena could feel the weight of the moment, the power dynamic shifting. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for something bigger, something more important. "I see," the man said slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'll need to review the situation. Please remain here." Without waiting for a response, he turned and disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Serena standing there, alone with her thoughts. She didn't know how long she waited, but it felt like an eternity. The other passengers had probably forgotten about her by now, gone back to their own worlds of books, movies, and quiet conversations. But Serena couldn't forget what had just happened. The way they had treated her, the way they had assumed she would just bow down and accept it ate at her. She wasn't the type to get upset easily, but this was different. This was a reminder that even in a world where people were supposed to be equal, things didn't always work out that way. She had been reminded of her place in society whether she liked it or not. But Serena wasn't going to let that message stick. She wasn't going to let them define her. The minutes stretched on, and Serena's patience was beginning to wear thin. She tapped her foot lightly on the floor, trying to distract herself. She looked at the emergency exit sign overhead, counting the seconds until someone would come back to address her. Finally, the curtain parted again, and the man in the blue uniform reappeared. His face was still serious, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, like he was about to reveal something. He motioned for Serena to follow him. She stood up without hesitation, her legs steady beneath her. She walked toward him, each step purposeful, each step bringing her closer to the resolution she had been waiting for. The flight attendant, still standing at the side, didn't look at her as she passed. She was avoiding eye contact, and Serena could tell that she was frustrated, maybe even a little scared. Serena didn't feel sorry for her. Not after everything that had happened. The man led her to a seat in first class, but this time, it wasn't the same feeling. Serena sat down, but her thoughts were still with the events that had just unfolded. She could hear the soft hum of the plane, the steady rhythm of the engines as they continued their journey. But the tension wasn't over. Not yet. The man in the blue uniform stood next to her for a moment, watching her carefully. He looked like he was about to say something, but then he simply nodded and walked away. Serena didn't know if she had won the battle, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let anyone ever treat her like that again. As she settled into her seat, the faint hum of conversation returned around her. Some passengers were still talking, some were watching the movie, and some had fallen asleep. But Serena felt different now. She felt like she had taken control of the situation. She wasn't just a woman sitting in first class, she was someone who wouldn't let anyone push her around. The flight continued, but for Serena, the journey had only just begun. She knew that the challenges she faced wouldn't disappear just because of one victory. But for the first time in a long time, Serena felt like she had taken a step forward. And that was enough for now. Serena walked down the narrow aisle, the murmurs of the passengers following her like a shadow. She could feel the weight of their eyes, their judgment pressing on her shoulders with every step. Who does she think she is? Someone whispered from behind her. She doesn't belong in first class. The words hit her, sharp and cold. They stung, but Serena had faced worse. She had heard these types of comments all her life, people doubting her, thinking she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong. She had learned to ignore them, to rise above them. But today felt different. Today, something inside her stirred. Serena refused to let those whispers break her. She had been through too much, worked too hard to let the words of strangers push her down. As she walked past the flight attendant, she gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of apology. It wasn't one of submission. No, it was a smile full of quiet defiance. Serena knew she had the right to be there, in that seat, and no one was going to make her feel like she didn't. Her mind raced. What was the plan? What would she do next? The flight attendants had already made their move. They had tried to force her to leave the first-class section. They had tried to make her feel small. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know the fire that burned inside her. Serena had always been strong, always had the ability to stand tall when others tried to push her down. But today, this wasn't just about standing tall. This was about showing them who she really was. As she made her way to the back of the plane, she could still feel the weight of the stairs, but she didn't let it show. She kept her posture straight, her head held high, though inside her heart was beating fast. There was a part of her that wanted to fight back immediately, to make her voice heard right there in front of everyone. But she knew that rushing into something without thinking could make things worse. She had to be smart about this. When Serena reached her seat in economy, she sat down, her hands gripping the armrests. She could still feel the tension from earlier, still hear the murmurs echoing in her mind. But now, she was more focused. She wasn't going to let anyone get away with this. Not this time. She pulled out her phone and began to type. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys as she composed a message. She wasn't sure who she would send it to yet, but she knew it had to go to someone who would help her. Serena didn't need to fight this battle alone. She had connections. She had people who cared about her, people who believed in her. The message was simple, but powerful. I need your help. They're trying to push me out of first class. I won't stand for this. I won't let them get away with it. Her thumb hovered over the send button, but before she could hit it, the flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle again. She was looking at Serena with a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. She hadn't expected this to be easy, but Serena could see it in her eyes. The flight attendant didn't want to deal with her anymore. She wanted the situation to be over. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her tone cold. "I need you to remain in your seat until we land. Please do not cause any more disruption." Serena looked up, meeting the flight attendant's eyes without hesitation. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. Instead, she said simply, "I'm not causing any disruption. I'm just sitting here. But I'm not going anywhere." The flight attendant stared at her for a moment, then turned and walked away, no doubt to report back to the rest of the crew. Serena let out a slow breath, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, but she knew she couldn't let the situation escalate any further. Not yet. She had to be patient. She had to wait for the right moment. Serena leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. She imagined what her next steps would be. She couldn't just sit here and do nothing. That wasn't who she was. But she also knew she had to play it smart. She had to let them make the first move. They had underestimated her. And when they did, she'd be ready to show them who she really was. The plane continued its flight, the hum of the engines a constant presence in the background. But to Serena, the time felt like it was moving slower than ever. Her mind raced with possibilities, her thoughts swirling around the confrontation that was sure to come. She knew the tension wasn't over. It couldn't be. As she sat there, her eyes wandering across the cabin, she noticed a few things. Passengers were still glancing at her, their gazes flickering between curiosity and judgment. They were wondering what would happen next. Some seemed to pity her, while others appeared to side with the flight crew, assuming she was in the wrong. But Serena wasn't bothered by their opinions anymore. She had spent too many years caring about what other people thought of her. Today was different. Today, she wasn't going to let them define her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She looked down at the screen. It was a reply to her message. The text was short, but it made her heart skip a beat. "I've got your back. Don't worry. We'll take care of this." Serena felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone. She had people who believed in her, who would help her take a stand. But even with that comfort, she knew the battle wasn't over. She still had to face the flight attendants, still had to face the people who thought they could push her around. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the minutes ticked by, Serena continued to sit quietly, her gaze fixed ahead, her thoughts focused on what was to come. She knew this wasn't just about a seat. This wasn't just about being moved from one section of the plane to another. This was about respect. This was about showing the world that she wasn't someone to be overlooked, someone who could be pushed around. She had fought too hard to get here, to be treated like she didn't belong. She wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Serena wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, for everyone who had ever been overlooked or treated as if they didn't matter. As the flight continued, Serena's mind began to slow down, her focus narrowing. The anger she had felt earlier was still there, but it had settled into a calm determination. She wasn't just reacting to what had happened to her, she was planning her next move. Serena didn't need to shout. She didn't need to create a scene. She just needed to show them who she was. And she knew that, eventually, they would see it. They would see the strength, the confidence, and the power she had inside. Serena leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. The hum of the engines was steady, a constant reminder that they were in the air, far from the ground and the chaos of her life below. But here, high above the earth, things didn't feel peaceful. The silence around her was deafening, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As she sat there, staring ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her chest tightened with the weight of so many eyes on her. She had always felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but today, it felt heavier than ever. The whispers of the passengers earlier still echoed in her mind. Who does she think she is? She doesn't belong in first class. The words, though soft, stung more than they should have. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself to others, trying to earn her place in this world, trying to prove that she was worthy of everything she had fought for. Yet, it was moments like these that made her question everything. Moments when people looked at her and saw nothing but the color of her skin or the clothes she wore, instead of the strength she carried, the intelligence she had worked so hard to cultivate. Serena clenched her fists, feeling the heat of her anger rise up again. She wasn't going to let them define her. She wasn't going to let their words control her. She had fought too hard to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. But still, the questions lingered. What was she supposed to do next? She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. It would be so easy to just ignore the situation, to let it go, to avoid the confrontation. But Serena had never been one to back down. Not this time. Not after everything she had been through. She had been taught from a young age that the world wasn't going to give her anything. If she wanted something, she would have to fight for it. And today, she was ready to fight. Ready to stand up for herself, for the woman she had become, for everything she had worked for. Her thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle once more. She was looking at Serena, but this time, there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't the cold, dismissive look from before. This time, there was a hint of uncertainty. A flicker of doubt. Serena couldn't help but notice it. The flight attendant knew she had crossed a line, and now, she wasn't sure how to handle it. Serena met her gaze calmly, her face a mask of determination. She wasn't going to let the woman's uncertainty distract her. She wasn't going to let the situation get out of control. Serena wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but she was also no longer the person who would let people walk all over her. This was her time to take control. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice faltering slightly. "I just need to make sure everything is okay. Are you comfortable in your seat?" Serena didn't respond immediately. She took her time, looking the flight attendant up and down. The woman was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to maintain the professionalism she had been taught. But Serena could see it in her eyes. She wasn't so sure anymore. "I'm fine," Serena replied, her voice steady. "But I have a question for you." She paused, making sure the flight attendant was paying attention. "Why did you move me from my seat? I paid for it. I wasn't doing anything wrong. What gave you the right to treat me like I didn't belong?" The flight attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard by Serena's directness. For a moment, she didn't say anything, as if trying to find the right words. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense. Serena could feel the other passengers watching, waiting to see how the flight attendant would respond. But this time, Serena wasn't backing down. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began, her voice strained, "there was a misunderstanding earlier. It was a simple mistake. We're just trying to follow the procedures." Serena shook her head. "No, it wasn't a mistake. You assumed I didn't belong there. That's not a mistake. That's judgment. And I won't stand for it." There was a moment of silence, as if the flight attendant was trying to process what Serena had said. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot. The confidence she had earlier seemed to be slipping away, replaced by uncertainty. Serena could see the cracks forming in the flight attendant's composure, and it made her feel stronger. I didn't mean to," the flight attendant started, but Serena interrupted her. "No," Serena said firmly. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And I'm not going to let you treat me like this anymore. The flight attendant opened her mouth to say something else, but Serena held up a hand, silencing her. She wasn't going to get into a back and forth argument. This wasn't the time for that. She had already made her point, and now it was up to the flight crew to figure out how they were going to handle it. As the flight attendant turned and walked away, Serena sat back in her seat, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Not now, not ever. Serena's mind was still racing, though. She had made her stand, but she knew this wasn't the end. The crew would likely escalate the situation, but she was ready for whatever came next. She was no longer the person who would shrink back in fear. She was no longer the person who would allow herself to be treated like she didn't matter. Today, she was taking control. As the minutes passed, Serena's grip on the armrests loosened. The tension in her body slowly started to fade, but the resolve in her heart only grew stronger. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was certain that it was going to be different. No more silence. No more letting others make decisions about her life. The seat belt sign blinked off, and passengers began to stir around her, preparing for the descent. Serena looked out the window, the city below now coming into view. She thought about everything she had overcome to get to this point, and she thought about everything that still lay ahead. This was just the beginning. The silence in the cabin was almost unbearable as Serena's words lingered in the air. The flight attendant froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. Serena could see the wheels turning in her head, the sudden realization dawning on her. She was not just an ordinary passenger. Serena's calm, steady voice continued, cutting through the stillness, "I own a significant portion of this airline. You see, I've worked in this industry for many years, and I built my career from the ground up. And I certainly don't appreciate being treated as though I don't belong." There was a pause just long enough for the words to sink in. The flight attendant blinked, looking around as if seeking support from her colleagues, but the cabin was quiet. No one said a word. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Serena was the center of attention, but this time, it wasn't because she had been treated unfairly. It was because, in this moment, she was the one holding the power. She wasn't just some random passenger who had been shuffled from her seat. She was the one in control now. The attendant stammered, her words faltering. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't know," she trailed off, her face flushing with embarrassment. Serena's gaze didn't waver as she stood tall, every inch of her posture radiating authority. "Well, now you know," Serena said with a smile that was sweet, but laced with enough sharpness to leave no room for doubt. "I expect my seat to be changed immediately." The flight attendant's face paled further, and Serena could see her struggling to gather herself. It wasn't just the shock of the revelation that had her rattled. No, it was the sudden shift in the power dynamic. The attendant had thought she was in control. She had thought Serena was the one who needed to comply. But now, Serena's words had turned the tables, leaving the attendant scrambling for the right response. I'll make the arrangements right away, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. Serena nodded, her smile still in place. "Thank you. I'll be expecting the change." As the flight attendant hurried off, Serena took a deep breath. She had done it. She had stood up for herself in a way she never had before. She wasn't just any woman in the back of the plane anymore. She wasn't just some passenger who had to accept being treated like she didn't matter. She was the woman who had been overlooked, underestimated, and misunderstood. But now, in this moment, she was reclaiming her power. The flight attendant returned a few moments later, moving quickly, almost nervously, as she approached Serena's seat. "Ma'am," she said, her voice now softer, more respectful, "I've made the arrangements. You can return to first class. Serena nodded, standing slowly. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some wide with surprise, others filled with curiosity. Serena's footsteps were steady, but inside, her heart was pounding. She wasn't just walking to the front of the plane. She was walking back to where she belonged. She was walking back to the place where she had worked so hard to earn her seat. It wasn't about the luxury of the first-class seat, it was about the respect. It was about proving that she would no longer be made to feel small. When Serena reached the front of the plane, she glanced over her shoulder. The flight attendant was standing there, looking uncertain but respectful. Serena gave her a small nod, acknowledging the change in the air. She didn't need to say anything. The look on her face said it all. As Serena sat back down in the first-class seat, she allowed herself a small, private smile. This moment, this victory, wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about taking back control of her own narrative. It was about standing up and saying, "I deserve this. I've earned my place." The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Serena didn't care about the whispers anymore. She didn't care about the stares. She knew who she was, and that was enough. The people around her could think what they wanted. She knew her worth. And as the plane soared through the clouds, Serena allowed herself to feel a quiet, powerful sense of satisfaction. As the plane began its descent toward their destination, Serena felt a new sense of clarity. She was no longer the woman who would shrink away when faced with injustice. She wasn't the woman who would sit back and accept being treated as less than she was. She had found her strength in that moment, and she knew that she would carry it with her moving forward. As the plane touched down, Serena gathered her things, preparing to disembark. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. When she stepped off the plane, she would be the woman who had claimed her place in the world, the woman who had shown that no one could ever take her worth from her again. The truth about Serena's power had been revealed, not in the flashy, grandiose way she had once imagined, but in a moment of quiet strength and unwavering resolve. Her journey was far from over, but this was the beginning of something new. The real victory wasn't in the seat. It wasn't in the acknowledgement of the flight attendant or the passengers. It was in the quiet sense of self-assurance that Serena now carried with her. She had proven to herself, and to the world, that she would never again allow anyone to define her worth. As the days passed, Serena continued her journey. Every step she took, every decision she made, was guided by the lesson she had learned on that plane. It wasn't about being loud or confrontational. It wasn't about making others feel small. It was about knowing who you were, knowing your value, and refusing to let anyone make you feel less than what you were worth. She thought back to the flight, to the moment when she had stood up, when she had claimed her seat, her space, and her power. It had been a small act, but it had changed everything. And as Serena moved forward in her life, she knew that she was capable of anything. No one could take that from her. Her story had only just begun, but Serena knew this. The world might try to knock her down, but she would always rise again. She would always fight for her place in the world, just as she had fought for her place on that plane. Because, in the end, it wasn't about the seat. It was about who she was. And Serena knew, with certainty, that she was someone who would always rise above. As the plane's wheels touched the ground, a gentle jolt passed through the cabin. Serena's hands rested on the armrests, her posture straight, eyes focused ahead. The moment had arrived. The feeling of justice coursed through her veins like a quiet river, steady, unwavering, and powerful. The plane had barely come to a complete stop before her phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with an alert that she couldn't ignore. It was a notification from her company, but not one she was expecting. The incident, the one that had started with an unfair treatment in first class, had already spread. Her heart raced as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the words on the screen. Serena, we've received reports of what happened on your flight. We've contacted the airline's corporate office, and they are investigating. Expect a formal update shortly. Rest assured, we're handling this. Serena exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised by the speed of the response. Her company knew how to act swiftly when things like this happened, especially when it involved one of their stakeholders. But this was more than just about the company. It was about her, her dignity, and her right to be treated with respect. As the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Serena stood slowly, collecting her things. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, though they no longer held the same judgment they had before. There was an air of uncertainty around them now, perhaps even a hint of admiration. They had witnessed something today, something they hadn't expected. She glanced toward the flight attendant, who stood at the front of the cabin, eyes wide and face pale. The woman's hands were clasped in front of her, a nervous, almost apologetic expression on her face. Serena met her gaze briefly, but there was nothing in her eyes but calm resolve. She had already spoken her piece. There was no need for words now. As the passengers slowly began to disembark, Serena walked to the front of the plane with a quiet confidence that demanded no further explanation. She could hear the murmurs, but she didn't listen. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others had no power over her. She was the one in control now. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from her assistant. Serena, the airline's corporate office has confirmed that they are reviewing the situation. They've suspended the flight attendant pending investigation. Expect a formal meeting soon. It seems that they're taking this very seriously. Serena's heart swelled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was more than just about a seat on a plane. This was about standing up, making her voice heard, and holding people accountable for their actions. Serena knew that this moment would be remembered not just by the people on the flight, but by anyone who had heard the story. She wasn't just a passenger in this story. She was the one who had turned the tables, who had shown that when you stand firm in your truth, you can change the course of any situation. She reached the gate, where airport security was waiting for her. Serena had expected this. She had heard that the airline had already taken action. The flight attendant, who had treated her with such disrespect, was being escorted off the plane by two uniformed officers. Serena didn't stop to watch. She didn't need to see the woman's defeat to feel satisfied. Serena had already won. As Serena walked down the corridor toward the terminal, she could feel the weight of the entire situation lifting off her shoulders. She had done what she needed to do. The world would know her story, and more importantly, the world would know that Serena wouldn't stand for injustice. In the days that followed, the news of the incident spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about a woman being moved from one seat to another. It was about the way she had been treated. The whispers of judgment, the way the flight attendant had assumed Serena didn't belong in first class, were all part of a larger story about prejudice, power, and standing up for yourself when no one else would. Serena's story was shared across social media, and soon it reached the eyes of the airline's upper management. The airline CEO reached out to Serena personally, offering an apology for the actions of the staff. "We take full responsibility," the message read. "We've already started an internal investigation, and we'll make sure something like this never happens again. Your experience does not reflect the standards we set for our team." Serena wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't seeking to tear anyone down. But this apology mattered. It showed that her voice had been heard. It showed that the airline was willing to do better. That, in itself, was a victory. The next day, the company sent a formal statement to the press, confirming that the flight attendant had been suspended pending an investigation. Serena didn't know what would happen to the woman in the long run. She didn't need to know. She had done her part by standing up. The rest would unfold as it should. In the following weeks, Serena began receiving messages from people all over the world. Some were messages of support, others were simply people sharing their own stories of unfair treatment and how they had stood up for themselves. Serena had become a symbol of empowerment for many, and that's when it truly hit her. This was bigger than just one incident. This was about creating a ripple effect of change. But as much as she appreciated the messages and the support, Serena knew the real change had to start with herself. She couldn't change the world in one day, but she could change how she viewed herself. The incident on the plane had been a wake-up call for her, a reminder that her worth was not defined by anyone else's judgment. It wasn't defined by the seat she sat in, the clothes she wore, or the way people saw her. It was defined by her own belief in herself and her unwavering commitment to justice. As time passed, Serena's life continued on its course. She attended meetings, made decisions, and led her company with the same grace and strength that had defined her from the start. The incident was a chapter in her story, but it wasn't the whole story. The lessons she had learned, the strength she had found in herself, would remain with her forever. And as she looked back on the events of that day, the whispers, the unfair treatment, the flight attendant's stunned expression, Serena couldn't help but smile. She had done what she had set out to do. She had taken control of her own narrative, and in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. Serena knew that this was just the beginning. Every day was a new opportunity to rise above, to push forward, and to demand the respect she deserved. She had earned her seat on that plane. And she would continue to earn her place in the world, one step at a time. Serena's phone buzzed again as she walked out of the terminal. The airport had cleared the crowds, but her mind wasn't quite finished with the flight's events. She had been through something significant today, something that would remain with her for a long time. But she was also curious. The situation, which had started as an injustice, was now starting to unfold into something bigger. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one moment of being mistreated. Serena had witnessed something that many people didn't get to see. She had seen how society had a tendency to judge based on appearances. And she had seen how someone could try to push back, to reclaim their space, and to take back control of what was rightfully theirs. As she opened the text message on her phone, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. It was from her assistant again. This time, the message felt different, more like a confirmation than just a simple update. Serena, the airline's corporate office is working on getting this all squared away. They're making it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated moving forward. You should be proud. You've made a real difference. It was a small, but powerful message. Serena took a deep breath and looked around the airport. The situation had only been a test, but now she could feel something changing inside her. She wasn't just fighting for her seat on the plane. She was fighting for the bigger picture. Her thoughts wandered back to the moment when she had stepped up, when she had stood firm and declared her position as not just a passenger, but someone with real power. The flight attendant had seen the shift in her attitude. The passengers had felt it, too. She could sense their change in perception. As she walked toward the exit, Serena noticed the eyes of a few people who passed by. They looked at her with something different now. It wasn't judgment. It was recognition. She could almost hear the silent questions in their minds. Who is she? What does she do? What makes her different from the others? Serena knew the answer to those questions. But more importantly, she had learned the most valuable lesson of all: she was in control of her own narrative. The opinions of others, no matter how harsh, had no lasting power unless she gave them the authority to do so. And now, she was in a place where she could finally see the world from a perspective of strength, not submission. The next few days passed by in a blur. As Serena prepared to return to her office, the messages from her company kept rolling in. Her team was closely following the updates from the airline, and the more they saw, the more it became evident that Serena's actions had set something in motion. She had taken control of the situation in such a way that it was impossible to ignore. The airline's higher UPS weren't the only ones paying attention. The public eye, too, had caught wind of the story. News outlets began picking up on the details of what had happened, and Serena found herself at the center of a media storm. But this time, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like something earned. A reporter from a prominent news station reached out, asking for an interview. Serena agreed, knowing that this was her chance to share her side of the story, to use her voice to encourage others who might find themselves in similar situations. She wanted people to know that they didn't have to stay quiet in the face of injustice. The interview took place a few days later. The studio was bright, the lights warm above her, but Serena felt strangely calm. The reporter sat across from her, ready to ask questions that would allow Serena to share her experience. She had no plans to hold back. "Serena, thank you for joining us today. Let's get straight to the point," the reporter began. "You've become quite a symbol of standing up for what's right. Tell us what happened on the flight, and why it mattered to you." Serena paused for a moment before answering. She didn't want to speak in anger, nor did she want to paint the situation as anything more than it was. But she knew how much her story could help. "I was flying, just like anyone else, when I was asked to move from first class to a regular seat," Serena said calmly, her voice steady. "It wasn't because I was being rude or causing a problem. It was because someone decided I didn't belong there. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect." The reporter nodded, understanding the weight of what Serena was saying. "I knew I had to stand up. I didn't do it just for me. I did it for anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about more than just physical spaces, it's about owning your worth, and never letting someone else's opinion dictate where you fit." The interview went on, and Serena's words were heard by thousands of people. By the time the segment aired, she had already received dozens of messages from people who had been inspired by her story. Some thanked her for speaking out. Others shared their own experiences of discrimination or unfair treatment. And still, others reached out to say that they, too, had started to think differently about their own situations. The airline's apology had been swift, and they made it clear that they were making changes to ensure that something like this would never happen again. They made sure that the flight attendant in question was held accountable, though Serena knew that the woman would likely have to face more than just losing her job. She would have to face the reality of her actions and the way she had treated Serena, who was, after all, a respected business owner. Serena wasn't satisfied with just an apology. She wanted to see change. She wanted the airline to commit to better training for their staff, and for them to prioritize inclusivity in every part of their business. And that's exactly what happened. A few weeks later, Serena received a letter from the airline's CEO. It was a personal letter, and it read, "Dear Serena, we want to thank you for bringing to light the issues that we hadn't fully addressed within our company. Your experience was unacceptable, and we are taking steps to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We are implementing new training programs for our staff, with a focus on respect, inclusivity, and equal treatment for all passengers. We are also reviewing our policies to ensure that every passenger, no matter their background or appearance, is treated with the dignity they deserve. We understand that actions speak louder than words, and we hope that you'll see the changes we're making moving forward. Thank you for your patience and for being a voice of reason in a situation that needed it. Best regards. John Harris, CEO, Airline Corporation." Serena read the letter, feeling a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. This was about a company deciding to do better, not just for her, but for everyone who flew with them. As the days turned into weeks, Serena's resolve remained unchanged. She continued to lead her company with the same conviction and clarity. She wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity or being known for this one event. She simply wanted to make sure that she lived her life as a person who stood up for what was right. And she did. As Serena stepped into the terminal, a sense of peace washed over her. She had been through a lot. The journey, which had started with a simple flight, had turned into something more. It wasn't just about a seat in first class or a flight attendant's mistake anymore. It was about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for anyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. The lights in the terminal seemed to shimmer just a little brighter today. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, and for a moment, everything felt still. Serena had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves, who kept to herself and did her job. But now, something had changed. She didn't need to be loud to make a difference. The power of her actions spoke for themselves. The moment she had stood up in that plane, the moment she had taken her seat back in first class, had changed everything. It wasn't just about the respect she had fought for in that moment. It was about showing everyone around her that they didn't have to accept being pushed aside. They didn't have to settle for being invisible. As she walked through the terminal, Serena's phone buzzed again. She had messages from her team, her family, and even a few from strangers who had heard her story. They were all full of praise, admiration, and gratitude. They called her brave. They called her strong. Serena didn't feel any different than she had before, but she could feel that something had shifted. The way people saw her had changed. The way she saw herself had changed. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And those who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming. That line ran through her mind like a gentle reminder. It had been true for her all along. People had looked at her on that plane, and they had assumed she was just another passenger, someone to be ignored. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that she had been building her strength quietly, day by day. They didn't see the years of hard work, the moments of self-doubt, the hours spent learning and growing. All they saw was a woman sitting in a seat, but they didn't see the journey that had brought her there. Now, they were starting to see. And it wasn't just because of the scene on the plane. It was because Serena had refused to let their judgment define her. She had refused to let their assumptions be her truth. As she made her way through the terminal, Serena saw a few people staring at her. She knew they had heard the story. She knew they were trying to figure out who she was, what made her different. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to explain herself. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile. They would figure it out eventually. And it wasn't up to her to make them understand. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a message. It was a notification from the news. The headline read, "Business owner challenges airline system, demands change." Serena paused for a moment and read the article. It talked about how she had stood up against unfair treatment and how she had inspired people to speak out. She smiled again. It wasn't the story she had expected to become part of. She hadn't wanted to be a hero or a symbol. But somehow, that's exactly what had happened. She had sparked something bigger than just her own fight. She had shown that a single person could stand up and make a difference, no matter how quiet or unnoticed they seemed at first. As the article continued, Serena realized that what she had done was more than just reclaiming a seat on an airplane. She had shown the world that true power didn't come from the loudest voice or the most aggressive actions. It came from the quiet confidence to stand your ground and demand respect. It came from the strength to hold your head high, even when others were determined to bring you down. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how true that was. Serena had always been someone who worked behind the scenes, someone who didn't seek attention or recognition. But she had always been strong. She had always known her worth, even when others hadn't. And now, the world was starting to see it too. She had been underestimated for so long. People had made assumptions about her because of her appearance, because of her background. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the person she had become. What mattered was that Serena had finally learned to speak up for herself. She had learned that her voice mattered, that her actions could create change. And now, she was ready to show the world just how powerful she truly was. As Serena walked out of the airport, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't carrying the burden of other people's expectations anymore. She was carrying her own confidence, her own strength. She didn't need anyone else to define her. She had already defined herself. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her best friend, who had been following the news closely. The text read, "Serena, you've done something incredible. I'm so proud of you. You've shown us all what it means to stand up for what's right." Serena smiled at the message. She wasn't looking for praise. She wasn't looking for validation. She had done what was right because it was the right thing to do. But hearing the words from her friend felt good. It reminded her that there were people who saw her, people who understood the power of her actions. As she stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city. It was a perfect evening, a perfect end to an unforgettable journey. Serena had come a long way. She had fought for herself, and in doing so, she had fought for everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been overlooked. And in that moment, Serena realized something important: she had already won. The world may have judged her based on her appearance or her background, but she had proven that her worth was not determined by the opinions of others. She had fought for her place, and now she could walk through the world with her head held high. She had earned her respect. She had earned her power. Serena knew that her story wasn't over. There would be other challenges, other moments when people would try to underestimate her. But she was ready. She was ready to face whatever came her way, knowing that she could stand tall and make a difference. And that, she realized, was the true power of standing up for yourself. It wasn't just about fighting for what was right in that one moment. It was about knowing that your voice, your actions, your presence mattered every single day. As she walked down the street, Serena felt a sense of peace. She had faced her fears. She had stood up for what was right. And now, she was free. Free to be herself. Free to live her life on her own terms. And in that freedom, she found the power she had been searching for all along. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And those who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming.